This is review session on chapter 4 on general economics. So in this chapter we are going to deal with price determination in different markets. So the various forms of markets include perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition and oligopoly, and we are going to see what are the distinguishing features of these markets and how prices are determined in these markets. Now over to the review questions. Question number 1. The average revenue for a firm is A. Higher than the price for the first unit sold and lower than the price for the last unit sold. B. The same as the price. C. Equal to the quantity sold divided by total revenue. D. Equal to the change in total revenue divided by the change in output. So we can see that the average revenue is nothing but the demand curve, and the demand curve is nothing but the price line. So the average revenue of a firm is nothing but the price. So the right answer is option B. It is the same as the price. Second question. Semi-durable goods are usually sold in the international market, local market, regional market, none of the above. So usually perishable goods, it cannot be transported for a long time period because there are chances they'll get rotten. So they'll be usually sold in the local market, and usually precious goods like gold and silver are traded in the international market, and goods which are semi-durable, which can last for a longer time period, are sold in the regional markets. So the right answer is option C, regional market. The third question. Which of the following is a market in which a user can purchase the commodity immediately? So here we have a situation where the buyer wants to buy the goods immediately without any delay in time. So such a market is available with the spot market. So the right answer is option D, spot market. The fourth question. Dash market prohibits unfair trade practices. So if a market is regulated, it has control over the fair means of transactions that are taking place. Or in other words, the regulated market will see to that all activities are going on in a just manner. The right answer is option B, regulated market. Fifth question. In a short period market, supply can be increased, fixed capital can be increased, supply is fixed, raw materials can be changed. Now whether in the short period supply is fixed or not, the supply will be fixed in a market period because the time span is very short. But with regard to the short period market, it is possible to increase the supply by using the labor more intensively, or by increasing the variable factor you can increase the supply. Therefore, supply is not fixed in the short period market. Now the fixed capital cannot be increased in the short period. It requires a long period to change the fixed capital, and changing the raw materials is also not possible in a short period because a change in raw material changes the complete technology or makeover of the product. So it also requires a longer time span. Therefore, the right answer is supply can be increased. That is option A. The sixth question. All of the following are types of imperfect competition except. So perfect competition, oligopoly, monopoly are all types of imperfect markets. Therefore, the odd one out is option D, unfair competition. The seventh question. Advertising to signal a firm's commitment to quality and service. So here we can understand that under perfect competition, since there are large numbers of sellers, an advertisement by an individual firm is not going to have a specific impact on that particular firm which is advertising. Or in other words, they are selling homogeneous product which does not have any product differentiation. So advertisement by a particular firm does not have any impact. Whereas under imperfect competition, advertising makes a crucial role. It plays a crucial role because the firm has to inform the customers about the changes in the quality and availability of goods. Therefore, advertising is a key feature of imperfect competition, but it is not prevalent under perfect competition. So it is found, option B is the right answer. It is found under imperfect competition but not under perfect competition. The eighth question. In a dash market, the goods are bought and sold in large quantities. So here we are talking about large purchases. It is a salient feature of wholesale market. So the right answer is option D, wholesale market. The ninth question. Marginal revenue is defined as total revenue divided by quantity, total revenue divided by total cost, the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity, the change in total cost divided by the change in total revenue. So we know that marginal revenue is nothing but changes in total revenue brought out by changes in quantity that is sold. That is, option C is the right answer. The change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. The 10th question. If marginal revenue for a firm is negative, marginal cost must also be negative. Total revenue will decrease if the firm sells more output. Total revenue must also be negative. The firm should shut down in the short run. So when the marginal revenue for a firm is negative, it shows that the total revenue is decreasing as the firm sells more output. That is option B. This is so because marginal revenue is nothing but changes in total revenue brought out by changes in output that is sold. So if marginal revenue is negative, the addition made to total revenue is decreasing. The 11th question. The term market refers to place where buyer and seller bargain a product or service for a price, place where buyer does not bargain, place where seller does not bargain, none of the above. So we find that market need not always be a physical atmosphere or physical place that is existing at a particular location. It is a market exists where buyer and seller meet and they bargain over a product and clear the market for a particular price. Therefore, both buyer and seller have bargaining power, and the right answer is option A, place where buyer and seller bargain a product or service for a price. The 12th question. The demand curve facing the firm has been estimated as follows. Which of the following statements about the firm's total revenue is correct? So we have the price which is given and then the output. So for you will notice that the total revenue is falling as we move from the 6th to the 7th unit. Okay, so when we are producing 6 units, our total revenue is 100 into 6, that is 600. and when we are producing 7 units, the price is 80. So it is 7 into 80. So it is definitely lesser than 600. So the right answer is option D. If firm increased output from 6 to 7 units, total revenue would decline. The 13th question. Total revenue for a firm arises due to dash of the product. Revenue is generated only when a product is sold in the market. So production of good alone does not guarantee a revenue. It has to be sold in the market. So therefore the right answer is option C, sales. Now the 14th question. A shift outward in supply curve will result in equilibrium price. Now we want to know what will happen if supply curve alone shifts outward but demand curve remains the same. So what will happen to the quantity sold and what is happening to the price of the equilibrium price. Therefore, let's draw a diagram related to this. So we have the original demand curve. We also have the original supply curve. Now, the demand curve remains the same, but supply curve alone shifts outward. So we will notice that when supply curve moves outward, the quantity that is traded increases, but the price falls. Now, why is that quantity traded is increasing? Now, when supply is increasing, the producers are willing to supply more output. And when they are supplying more, the quantity that is traded also increases. On the other hand, the increase in supply, when it is more than the demand, it will pull the prices down. Therefore, the prices are falling. So we can conclude that when the supply curve is shifting outward, it will result in the equilibrium price. It would fall, but the quantity would increase. Therefore, the right answer is option C, equilibrium price decreasing and quantity increasing. Now for the 15th question, a shift inward in demand curve will result in equilibrium price. So earlier we saw how the demand curve was the same but supply alone shifted outward. But now we are going to see how the supply curve remains the same but the demand curve is going to shift inward. So we have the original demand curve sloping downward, the original supply curve sloping upward, and now the demand is shifting inward. So the demand curve moves towards the left. So we will notice that initially the firm is able to sell more output, but now the quantity of output has fallen. But earlier the price was more, but now the price has fallen. We can conclude that an inward shift in demand curve, keeping supply curve the same, will reduce the equilibrium price as well as the equilibrium quantity. So looking into the right answer, the right answer is option C, the price is decreasing, quantity is also decreasing. The 16th question, a decrease in supply will lead to. So let's see what happens. Earlier we saw an increase in supply, but we'll see here for a decrease in supply. The original demand curve is downward sloping. The original supply curve is upward sloping. Now, an inward shift in supply curve will move the supply curve inward. So we will notice that the original output was greater, and after the inward shift in output, the quantity sold has fallen. But on the other hand, since the supply has reduced itself, the price has increased. So we can conclude that the quantity sold falls but price increases. So the right answer is an increase in price, increase in quantity, increase in demand, increase in sales. So we have seen that a decrease in supply will increase the price. Option A is the right answer. 17th question. An increase in demand will lead to. Okay. So here we will see the original demand curve is downward sloping. Original supply curve is upward sloping. And here the demand is increasing. In other words, it's moving towards the right. So you will notice that the output initially it was less. Now after the outward shift in demand, it has increased. Price also was lower, but now after the increase in demand, price also has increased. We can conclude that an increase in demand keeping supply constant will increase both the quantity as well as the equilibrium price. Okay, so the right answer is it will increase the equilibrium price. That is option C. 18th problem. The kinked demand curve model of oligopoly assumes that the elasticity of demand. Now, before moving on to the options, now let's have an understanding of a revision of the kinked demand curve. You'll find the kinked demand curve is less elastic above the kink and it is more elastic below the kink. Or in other words, the upper portion of the demand curve is less elastic, but the lower portion of the demand curve is more elastic. Now, why is this so? Okay. Now, when a firm is following a policy of increase in price, you'll notice that the other firms would not follow that, because an increase in price of a price by a particular firm will reduce the total market share of that particular firm, and consumers will move to other firms, oligopoly firms that are available in the market. Therefore, an increase in price will not be followed by other firms. Or in other words, the firm which is following an increase in price will be isolated and it will be the only firm which is following an increase in price. Therefore, consumers will feel that only this firm has increased the price. Therefore, they will be more responsive to changes in price. Or in other words, they will restrict their demand accordingly. That is, the elasticity is more. On the other hand, when the firm follows a fall in price, a reduction in price, all other firms will be threatened in the market, because this particular firm which is following a reduction in price will attract the customers or consumers of the other firms in the market. In other words, a fall in price will be copied by other firms in the market in order to sustain themselves in the market. That is, the fall in price will not be felt by the consumers, because since all the firms are following that, it will be considered as a general price change. Therefore, the response of consumers will not be much. In other words, the elasticity is less. So the right answer is option C. It is less elastic for an increase in price and it is more elastic for a decrease in price. The 19th question. Supply and demand both shifting outward, but the shift in supply is more than the shift in demand. So let's draw a diagram and find out how it works out. So we should keep in mind that both demand curve and supply curve are moving outward. but the outward shift in supply is greater than the outward shift in demand. So we have original demand curve sloping downward, original supply curve sloping outward. Now the change in demand, it is shifting outward, so it changes to a new demand curve. So you will find that the demand curve is shifting outward like this, and the supply curve is also shifting outward, but the change in supply is greater than the change in demand. So you will notice that the supply curve has shifted outward, but it is greater than the shift in demand. So original equilibrium will be here. It will be at this point, and the new equilibrium will be at this point. So you will notice that compared to the original equilibrium, the quantity that is traded has increased, but the price has fallen. So quantity traded increases, but price falls. So here we will notice that equilibrium price will decrease, but quantity will increase. The right answer is option D. The 20th question, supply and demand both shift outward, but demand shifts outward more than the supply. Both are shifting outward, but the change in demand is greater than the change in supply. So let's draw and find out how it works here. So we have the original demand curve, original supply curve, and now we have the change in demand. It is shifting outward, so the curve is moving outward. And now there is also a shift in supply, but the shift is smaller than the shift that takes place in demand. So here the supply curve is shifting outward. The original equilibrium is at this point where demand and supply has intersected, and the new equilibrium is at this point. So you will notice that the quantity traded has increased and the price also has increased. So we can conclude that when the shift in demand is greater than the shift in supply and an outward shift, both the quantity and the price increases. So looking into the right answer, you can say option A is the right answer, where equilibrium price and quantity both increase. 21st question, which of the following definitely raises the equilibrium price? An increase in both demand and supply, a decrease in both demand and supply, an increase in demand combined with a decrease in supply, a decrease in demand combined with an increase in supply. Now, if the equilibrium price has to increase, an outward shift in demand or an increase in demand will always pull the prices up. And on the other hand, a decrease in supply will always pull the prices up. Therefore, a combination of an increase in demand and a decrease in supply will pull the equilibrium price upward. Therefore, the right answer is option C, an increase in demand combined with a decrease in supply. 22nd question, which of the following market structures is characterized by many firms? So, we have monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopoly and duopoly. Now monopoly is a situation of single seller, so it does not have many firms. Duopoly is a situation of two firms, so it is not many firms. Oligopoly, there are very few firms which compete with each other. And if you consider monopolistic competition, it is a combination of perfect competition and monopoly. To what extent is it a perfect competition is that there are large numbers of sellers in the market and large numbers of buyers are there, but for each market that particular seller is a monopolist, or the seller is having monopoly power over his set of consumers. Therefore, large numbers of firms are prevalent under monopolistic competition. 23rd question. Price and output are determined with a common understanding under closed oligopoly, collusive oligopoly, partial oligopoly, imperfect oligopoly. So, when firms have an understanding, they consult each other and then determine a price and output. It is only under a collusive oligopoly. Under collusive oligopoly, the firms organize themselves, they come together and decide on a common understanding over the price and output in order to avoid cutthroat competition in the market by reducing prices. Right answer is collusive oligopoly. 24th question. If a firm produces where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, then we know that. Now, when the firm is having marginal revenue greater than marginal cost, it means for every additional unit of output that is sold, the firm is incurring lesser cost, but it is earning more revenue. Therefore, it is advisable for the firm to produce more output and sell them in the market and make a profit. So, the firm will make more profits by increasing its output. Option B is the right answer. The 25th question. If marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue, it is a situation where to produce every extra unit of output, the firm is incurring more than what it could raise by selling it in the market. So, therefore, if the firm continues to produce more, it will start incurring losses. The right answer is the firm will lower profits by increasing output. 26th question. If the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves intersect at two different points, then maximum profit occurs at. So, we know that the marginal cost curves intersect with the marginal revenue curves at 2 points. But where the marginal cost cuts the marginal revenue from below is an ideal point, because before the intersection of this point, the firm would have already reaped profits, or wherever the marginal cost is cutting from below, the firm has more scope for earning profit. Therefore, the right answer is it should cut from below. 27th question. Which of the following is not a precondition for successful price discrimination? So, price discrimination is a situation where different prices are charged for the same output, okay, to different consumers. So, here we have preventing resale between different markets, ensuring that consumers in each market do not know what price is being charged in other markets, being able to identify separate demands, having some monopoly power. So, price discrimination is possible only if resale is not possible between two different markets. And definitely the two different markets should have different elasticities of demand, only then price discrimination is possible. And to discriminate, the firm should have some monopoly powers. Therefore, the right answer is option B, because it is not a precondition for implementing price discrimination. 28th question. A profit maximizing discriminating monopolist will adjust its output between its market so as to, okay, so you will notice that the equilibrium level of output is fixed at the industry level by interaction of marginal revenue and marginal cost curve, and that particular marginal revenue is transferred to individual sub-markets, and based on this marginal revenue, wherever they cut the marginal cost, the individual market output is determined at each sub-market. Therefore, option A is the right answer, where the marginal revenue is in each market is equal. 29th question. A monopolist adopting price discrimination will find it profitable when? So you'll notice that the firm has a common cost, that is the marginal cost is common for the firm, but the marginal revenue from each market, each sub-market is different, because each sub-market has different elasticities of demand. Therefore, the marginal cost should be equal to the marginal revenue in submarket 1 and marginal revenue in submarket 2. Therefore, the right answer is option C, MC equal to MR1, and that is equal to MR2. 30th question. A firm is a monopolistically competitive industry, sells a fixed amount of output regardless of price, must raise price to sell more output, can sell an infinite amount of output at the market determined price, must lower price to sell more output. So you'll notice that a monopolistic competitive firm has a downward sloping demand curve or AR curve. So when the demand curve is downward sloping, it implies that if the firm wants to sell more output, it should definitely lower its prices. So the right answer is option D, must lower price to sell more output. 31st question. Monopoly refers to a market where there is only one buyer, only one seller, only one buyer and one seller, only one product available. So monopoly is a situation of a single seller. So therefore, the right answer is option B, only one seller. 32nd question. A monopoly creates a deadweight loss because the monopoly sets a price that is too low, produces less than the efficient quantity, produces more than the efficient quantity, earns a normal profit. Now, a monopolist is always a profit seeker. He would like to maximize profits always and is not actually bothered about the full capacity or efficient capacity of the plant. In other words, he will always target for profit maximizing output, which happens at MR, marginal revenue equaling marginal cost. The efficient point occurs where the average cost is at its minimum. So, if a monopolist firm is maximizing profit, which does not happen at the lowest point of the average cost, he will still continue production. Or producing below the full capacity is a predominant feature of monopoly. Therefore, the right answer is option B, produces less than the efficient quantity. 33rd question. When the demand curve and marginal revenue curves are downward sloping, marginal revenue lies below demand. Demand intersects the horizontal axis halfway to the origin. from where marginal revenue intersects the axis. Demand becomes more elastic, marginal revenue becomes steeper. It is possible for demand to increase. So, when the demand curve is downward sloping, we always see that the marginal revenue lies below it. In case of a demand curve parallel to the x-axis, marginal revenue is equal to demand curve, or marginal revenue is equal to average revenue curve. But when demand curve is downward sloping, marginal revenue always lies below it. So the right answer is option A, marginal revenue lies below demand. 34th question. At short run equilibrium, a profit maximizing monopoly will equate. So here marginal cost and price, marginal cost and marginal revenue and average total cost, price and average total cost. Always profit maximizing output or a profit maximizing equilibrium happens where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So the right answer is option B, marginal cost and marginal revenue. 35th question. Price discrimination is adopted by the monopolist in order to earn supernormal profits, produce maximum output, minimize the cost of production, improve the quality of the product. Now, the main intention for a monopolist to follow price discrimination is that he wants to tap the consumer surplus fully for each market depending on its price elasticity. Or in other words, the firm is following price discrimination with sole intention of earning supernormal profits. So the right answer is option A, earn supernormal profits. 36th question. Which of the following is not an objective of price discrimination? Surplus profit, economies of scale, price equity, and favors. So we'll notice that price discrimination is not followed out of favoritism. It is followed in order to make surplus profit. It is followed in order to compensate for economies of scale. It is also followed in order to to follow price equity. So therefore the right answer is option D, favors. 37th question. A market where new firms can enter the market and compete with existing firms is known as closed oligopoly, collusive oligopoly, open oligopoly, competitive oligopoly. So here we have the firms have no restrictions to enter the market and compete with the existing firms. Therefore, it is a key feature of open oligopoly. The market is open for any kind of competition. 38th question. Price leadership is an important feature of. So, under closed oligopoly, you have entry restriction on entry. Under collusive oligopoly, you have all firms together decide on a common price. Under partial oligopoly, it is a mixture of both closed and open. Under full oligopoly, you will notice that the firms identify a dominant firm who acts as a price leader, and all other firms will follow his price strategy. The right answer is option D, full oligopoly. 39th question. A perfectly competitive firm's demand curve is. So under perfect competition, all units of output are sold for the same price. So it is parallel to the x-axis. And since all units of output are sold for the same price, marginal revenue will be equal to the average revenue. Therefore, the right answer is it is the same as the firm's marginal revenue. That is, the demand curve and marginal revenue are equal under perfect competition. 40th question. In a perfectly competitive market, an economic profit is certain, consumers are persuaded by advertising, each firm takes the goods price as given to it by the market, each firm sets its own price so that it is different from its competitors. So in a perfectly competitive market, we'll notice that the firms are price takers. In other words, prices are determined at the industry level based on forces of demand and supply, and that price which is fixed at the industry level is transferred to each firm, or each firm takes the price given to it by the market. That is option C. 41st question. In perfect competition, the price of the product is determined where? The industry. So we have discussed already, under perfect competition, prices are determined at the industry level by the interaction of demand and supply curves. Therefore, option B is the right answer. Supply curve and industry demand curve intersect. 42nd question. A perfectly competitive industry has perfectly elastic supply curve, perfectly elastic demand curve, negatively sloped demand curve, positively sloped demand curve. So here we notice that for a perfectly competitive firm, the demand curve is perfectly elastic. Or in other words, for a particular price, the consumers can demand as much as quantity of output as possible. So the right answer is option B. It's not option C, it is option B, perfectly elastic demand curve. It will be parallel to the x-axis. 43rd question. In a perfectly competitive industry, there are many buyers and many sellers but there might be only one or two buyers, many buyers but there might be only one or two sellers, only firm that sets the price for the others to follow. So perfect competition has many buyers and many sellers. That is the main feature of perfect competition. So the right answer is option A, many buyers and many sellers. 44th question. In the long run, for a perfectly competitive market, so here we have options related to when firms will enter and when firms will leave the market. So you will observe that in the long run, whenever the perfectly competitive industry is earning more profits, it will attract more firms to enter the market, because firms will believe by entering the market they can also make more profits. But ultimately they will eat out the excess profits. And when the moment the firms enter the market, all firms will increase their output. Therefore, the supply curve will shift outward or rightward. On the other hand, when there is absolutely no profit, you will notice that the industry will not attract any new entrant in the industry, or new firms will not be entering the industry, and firms will also not be leaving the industry. On the other hand, when there is the profit is less, or when there is a situation of negative profits, you will notice that some firms will leave the market because they are demotivated by the falling profits. And the moment those firms leave the market, the quantity supplied at the industry level will fall. In other words, the supply curve will shrink, or it will shift inward. Therefore, option A, B and C are all applicable in the long run for a perfectly competitive market. The right answer is option D, All of the above answers are correct. 45th question. The short run supply curve for a perfectly competitive firm is its. So we now have to identify in the short run what is the supply curve of a perfectly competitive firm. Now, the perfectly competitive firm has average revenue equal to marginal revenue, and it is parallel to the x-axis. The average revenue is nothing but the demand curve. So we already know the shape of the demand curve under perfect competition. Now, equilibrium happens where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Now, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost will determine the equilibrium level of output, or what quantity will be sold in the market. So since average revenue or marginal revenue is constant, changes in marginal cost will bring out changes in quantity traded in the market. Or in other words, the marginal cost curve acts as the supply curve of the competitive firm. The right answer is the rising portion of marginal cost curve. Now, why the rising portion of marginal cost curve is that the firm will earn profits only when the marginal cost is cutting the marginal revenue from below. Therefore, only the rising portion of marginal cost curve is considered. 46th question. If an economist says that firm practices price discrimination, that firm is exploiting the poor, charging different prices for the same good or service, making great efforts to keep its costs as low as possible, producing two products, one with decreasing returns to scale and the other with increasing returns. Now, price discrimination is nothing but charging different prices from different consumers for the same good or service. Therefore, option B is the right answer. Charging different prices for the same good or service. 47th question. Pure oligopoly deals with. So under pure oligopoly, you will find that all firms are producing identical homogeneous products. So option A, homogeneous products, is the right answer. 48th question. A central association fixing prices and output for oligopoly firms are called as. So here an association is formed wherein the firms are organizing themselves into a kind of an association. Therefore, the right answer is organized oligopolies. 49th question. Which market structure is characterized by a few interdependent firms? So, monopoly, perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly. Monopoly, you have only one seller. Under perfect competition, you have large numbers of sellers, but they do not depend on each other. Under monopolistic competition, there are large number of sellers, but they do not depend on each other. But under oligopoly, you have firms that depend on each other for the market share, because a price increase or a price decrease by one firm will alter the market share of all other firms. That is, this firm which has reduced the price will attract the consumers of the other firms. Therefore, right answer is option D, oligopoly. The 50th question. In the long run equilibrium, perfectly competitive firms produce where average revenue is zero, where marginal cost is minimized, where average total cost is minimized. All of the above are correct. So any firm in the long run and under perfect competition will produce at the lowest point on the average cost curve. So the right option is option C, where average total cost is minimized. So we have come to the end of the review session on chapter 4 in general economics. I hope this session was more informative and clear to you all. For any further queries, please mail us to queries@greymatteracademics.com. Have a nice day. Thank you.